Welcome to Windows on the World, and tonight we're going to do a follow-up to shows that we've put out recently. We've covered the whole of the occult side of Freemasonry. When I say the whole of it, I mean the main lodges such as the Martinists and the Ellis Cohen, who nobody else seems to talk about. We did a show called A Cult That Rules the World ? And you can find that as an article and a series of shows on the homepage at windowsontheworld.net. Put it into the search bar, it'll come up. And also we have done quite a lot on the Rosicrucians, and they all come together with their influence under this banner of Gnosis. And I've found several very interesting volumes which do put the bigger picture of it all together, but in an incredibly complicated way. So I'm going to try and decode some of that for you in this show, The Cult of Gnosis. And we're going to be talking about the influence of the Martinists on the French Revolution, which is buried but quite available. We have covered the French Revolution in our show Revolution, and we talked about a great reference book written by James Billington in the 90s called Fire in the Minds of Men, The Origin of the Revolutionary Faith. Now, this book is brilliant, but it doesn't scratch the surface as to who was really in charge. It gives the names of the people up front, but the people who were actually directing it were definitely linked to these lodges. And of course, we had the Grand Orient Lodge, which is the most influential lodge in France, which operates under the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which is a purely Kabbalistic order with its 33 degrees. So we're going to look at this and more and where these influences came from. So do check out the Elected Priesthood of the Universe. That refers to the Ellis Cohen. That's what Ellis Cohen means. And the Ellis Cohen have been around since the 1700s. They are alleged to have disbanded a little bit like the Bavarian Illuminati, but they have had a resurgence in the 1940s publicly with somebody called Robert Amberlane, and we've referred to his work in the shows previously. We also need to talk about Rosicrucian mystery and Kabbalah conmen. Put those into the search bar at windowsontheworld.net. The Rosicrucian mystery and Kabbalah conmen. You will find a wealth of information there about the Rose Cross, the Order of the Rose Cross, and Kabbalah. There is so much nonsense talked about Kabbalah that most of it is absolutely worthless when we're trying to look at how it has influenced history. So when we look at the Rose Cross, which is a very Kabbalistic order, which first surfaced in the 1600s and was alleged to have been put to sleep for 140 years after the death of their illumined father R.C. Based on the story of Lazarus, he rose from the grave. You can read the Forma Fraternitatis, the Confessio, and the Alchemical Wedding, which are 3 Rosicrucian documents, and they are linked to the Rosicrucian mystery. You can also find them on the internet, but they're very allegorical, esoteric, and they kind of put Father R.C., the illumined brother, in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. And this is really where it all starts to go wrong, because these orders were all about their personal power, not the divine inspiration from Jesus through God, which was the order from which they came from and the order of which they overturned. So this allegorical belief by Freemasons of the Rosicrucian order reveals some striking ways in how the present world order is actually being arranged. Whether by design or belief, this template for domination explains how the population have been subjugated by a group ruling by assumption through their interpretation of a biblical story. So as they say themselves, like all other mystery orders, the Order of the Rose Cross is formed on cosmic lines. As one needs 12 balls of equal size to cover and hide a 13th from view, and 12 signs of the zodiac envelop our solar system, and 12 half-tones of the musical scale comprise the octave, the Rosicrucian order is also composed of 12 brothers and a 13th who is head of the order and is hidden from the outside world by the 12. Even the pupils of the school, lay brothers and lay sisters, never see him, but at nightly services in the temple all feel his presence when he enters, and that is the signal for the ceremony to begin. As we go on, even more will be revealed. The story of the revolution and the influences, the Martionists, starts with the Cathars of the Languedoc, named after catharsis. They were an extreme set known as Gnostics. Now, this is where it gets quite confusing, especially for me years ago, because when I looked at Gnosticism, a lot of it appeared to be Christian influenced. What we have to delineate is where the belief in Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit differs to the belief in the self being illumined to become one as God with the universe. This is the work of the occultist and the magician. The Cathar priests were actually known as perfects, who claimed to attain trance-like states of nirvana, inducing themselves and their initiates into what Aristotle had called catharsis, a state of trance induced by some repetitive motion or breathing. The term was first coined by Aristotle to identify the effect of a state of purification brought about by means of dramatic and violent scenes. Now, these people, by the accounts that we have, were quite extreme. Of course, the Catholic Church wiped them out and denounced them as heretics. That was the Albigensian Crusade of 1174. And when we look at the definitions of heresy by the Catholic Church, they changed over the centuries until we came to the heretics of the Reformation, who merely wanted to read the Bible in English and did not believe that the wafer and the wine was the literal blood of Jesus Christ as in the Eucharist. So they were burned at the stake if they didn't agree with that, and they were allowed to recant, but if they recanted they would have had to accept the Catholic faith and all of its dogma. But yes, out of this cult of the Cathars, let's get back to that. Out of this cult came the Kabbalists of the Languedoc, who existed in the same place around the same time in the 12th century. Now, there's no clear connection between these two groups, but when we look at who was influenced by both by Kabbalah and the Cathars, then we do see a connection between both of these groups, both the Kabbalists of the Languedoc and the Cathars of the Languedoc. And from this cult of Gnosis and Kabbalah, which later became linked through Rosicrucianism, came many revolutionary, or what are nowadays, I suppose, referred to as globalist movements. And the Bavarian Illuminists, led by Adam Weishaupt, are included in this. And the European lodges, including the Grand Orient, came under the Scottish Rite, as we've said, who were all Kabbalists. Very important to reiterate that. These groups were involved heavily in the French Revolution, setting up revolutionary groups which were publicly new movements with new leaders. The same thing happens today. We have divide and rule distraction by competing groups, competing ideologies, all as a front for what's going on underneath. All of these groups enable what is going forth. Sometimes this is described in the conspiracy world as the Hegelian dialectic. In other words, you have a synthesis and an antithesis, and they create this synthesis. The Rose Cross version of this is the blending of fire and water, and we're going to get into that during the show. We've actually reported on the illumination of the Rose Cross, the Order of the Rose Cross, and the Order Ro-Kra, which is the Ellis Cohen. In that show, the elected priesthood of the universe and a cult that rules the world. You'll find about 3 or 4 shows on this, and they're all really distilled down. That's the whole point of this, because there's no way I want to get into esoteric rambling, which always happens with these Freemasonic researchers. In a way, it's a form of gatekeeping, because they don't know very much, but we're not going to be doing that. So, these revolutionary groups were led in the main by pawns at the time and aristocrats with the eager need to be part of the world revolutionary movement. See Guy William Carr and the World Revolutionary Movement. Pawns in the Game is the name of the book. That describes what we're talking about here, along with Fire in the Minds of Men by James Billington, who actually gives you the through line of action of everything and every person who was fronting the French Revolution. So this world revolutionary movement seemed to have absorbed the aristocrats and to a great extent the royal families of Europe. It was on the face of it the need for knowledge which led to change. Those pulling the strings know how eager the acolytes are, and the European royals sacrificed themselves by getting involved within these movements. Not all of them, of course. But the main aim of the revolutionaries was to destroy the power of the early Christianity and replace it with humanistic communism. That has been the main goal of these occult Freemasonic lodges and the movements such as the French Revolution and earlier than that the Russian Revolution of 1917. All Freemasons initially had the goal of destruction of monarchy, to replace it with ultimately this one world unstructured governance system. So from then a republic, that was the next stage, and then what we have now, puppet governments under a global plan led out in the open by the UN and its agencies, under which their corporations and NGOs are the shadow governments in countries all over the world, and the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, etc., are basically the organisations which hold the power. They lend the money which bankrupts the countries, which then have to take on more debt. So in France, the cult had been organised around the estates of the Duke of Toulouse during the papacy of Innocent III in 1198 to 1216. This is basically what Pierre Aubry is saying in his book, which is called Synarchy. We're going to get into that as well. So quite a lot of reference material in this show tonight. But the Cathars began to be chased out of France by the local Catholic communities around 1204 at the Montségur Fortress Temple, which their members claim to have used as a refuge for the Holy Grail. And of course, the attachment of legends to these cults has helped in keeping the interest in them going. This has been especially true of the Order of the Rose Cross, who have been put up there on a pedestal, when in fact we only have to look at the recently destroyed Georgia Guidestones to see that this was a Rosicrucian symbol. And they wanted to reduce the world's population massively, well under the global billion. I think it was 500 million living in harmony with nature. So this is the end result of what we see as this esoteric Gnostic movement. So the interest in this sort of occult side of it and this romanticising is superficial and unrealistic, but it's all we get from these people who throw out books on Freemasonry. They're basically gatekeepers. So the fanatical Gnostic Cathars resisted until 1244 in France, when Montségur, the fortress, was taken, and most of their followers committed suicide by throwing themselves from the walls. This echoes what happened with the Zealots in the Masada centuries and centuries earlier, in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And I've been looking into that. We're going to be going into the Dead Sea Scrolls and the connections between these esoteric organisations which actually usurped the original Christianity. So the Cathar tradition lived on among the Templars, the Knights Templars. Of course, they were well into the cover stories of the worthy Knights of the Poor Money Temple and the Knights Hospitallers of St. John. They go by many different titles, and of course they were allegedly disbanded. Their gold went to Switzerland and other places like Malta when they were being chased by the Muslims. I've covered all this in shows. Quite dense, isn't it? Even when you're trying to simplify it. But from the influence of the Cathars, we get the Martinists and the Ellis Cohen. So let's get on to this bit first, because I've actually decided to take out some of these protagonists, otherwise the show's going to be too long. So let's cut that and go straight to Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who lived 1743 to 1803 and was initiated into Martinez de Pasquale's Ellis Cohen, the elected priesthood of the universe, in October 1768 by Baudry de Balzac, and towards the end of 770 he became Martinez de Pasquale's personal secretary. So Louis Claude de Saint Martin is a very influential Martinist and one of the founders of the Martinist organisation. St. Martin's contribution to Martinism was to emphasise the inner way, through which one can find the essence of the universe as oneself. In other words, they're not looking outside themselves for inspiration from God. They're not being conduits to inspiration. They are actually saying, we are the inspiration. We are the perfect man. Adam Kadmon, we are the perfect man, goes back into Kabbalah, which hugely influenced and destroyed what was European Christianity by its infiltration. So the entire doctrine is self-centered in such a way that every man can perceive the life substance behind the universe as himself. He is the creator of the universe. And we see that to an extent with people who say they are manifesting their own reality. This is the same mindset that came from this twisted version of Gnosis. And St. Martin stated, man is the only true witness and positive sign by which the supreme universal source may be known. Well, also he said, man should sound the depths of his own being and affirm the sublimity of his own essence if he would demonstrate the divine essence, for there is nothing else in the world that can do it directly. In other words, there is no Jesus, there is no God, there is only yourself. This is leaving God and Jesus out of the picture and ties in with the Kabbalists and their quest for illumination. This is what Lucifer tried to do, and the Luciferian theme is carried on throughout occult Freemasonry. This self-centering process is also a reflection of a most important influence on St. Martin, which came from the German occultist of the 17th century, Jacob Boehme. And Louis-Claude de St. Martin died of apoplexy on October the 13th, 1803, but was very influential, and the Martinists carry on being influential and were influential during the French Revolution. By defining the characteristic of St. Martin's form of mysticism, though, we are able to determine also the characteristics of his mission. The first step that St. Martin considered was that of liberating himself from all the ideas that others wished to impose on his mind without the control of his own reason. Hence, out of this we get the Age of Reason. We get these people who were nationalists, internationalists, now globalists, acting on our behalf and through our consent. This is very much like what happened during the European Enlightenment. St. Martin rejected all that is material and not conducive to the development of the spirit. Now, this seems to be what they had in common with the earlier Gnostics. But what they did is twisted it to become themselves. All about themselves. Louis-Claude St. Martin is said to have had close contacts with Comte de Gebelin, Benjamin Franklin, Sir Francis Dashwood, and the Golitsyn family in Russia. Now, of course, Sir Francis Dashwood, we can look him up and we can link him, I think, to the Hellfire Caves, and I think that's near Watford, isn't it? I've actually been up there, and actually Anthony J. Hilder did a really good show on that. And he talked about what happened and this Hellfire Club. And of course, this was the degeneration of the aristocracy. That's what we're talking here. But they thought they were being illumined. And then, of course, later we get the complete puppet, in a way, Aleister Crowley, who still influences people to this day. Crowley, of course, was a waster and aristocrat. And his magic never worked. And it just saw the destruction of those around him and eventually the destruction of himself. So when we look at Louis-Claude St. Martin, these are the predecessors of what we're talking about today's occultists. And he studied with Swedenborg, he studied the writings of Swedenborg, and he wrote Nouvelle Homme in collaboration with Swedenborg's nephew. And when St. Martin died in 1803 rather, his influence lived on, especially in France, Italy and Russia. In our previous shows, we have found connections between Swedenborg and Chaim Samuel Jacob Falk, also known as the Baal Shem Tov of London, who was accused of being a Sabbatean by rabbis in London. He was a Sabbatean Frankist, and we talked about how Frankism is another branch of this. and the Frankists actually took over Ireland with the cult of Mary, again to take you away from the teachings of Jesus, bringing Mary out front, putting Jesus in second place, and putting statues of Mary everywhere rather than Jesus. And we talked about that in the Irish show we did, which was the Count who saved Ireland. And you can find that in the archive, the Irish Count. Check it out. So John Baptiste, let's do this again. Very important, this one. John Baptiste Villemos, 1730 to 1840, was a pupil of Martinez de Pasquale, who became a Mason in 1750. And in 1753, he founded a lodge called La Parfaite Amitié, of which he became the master. He worked with Bacon de Chevalier, a deputy Grand Master of the Ellis Cohen, and Villemos was introduced to the German Masonic Order of Strict Observance Templier, in which in 1772 was connected to the Adam Weishaupt lodges of the Illuminati of Bavaria, the most famous Masonic order of Germany during the French Revolution, to which also belonged Jacques Necker and Philippe Égalité. So in 1774, Villemos founded a new lodge in Lyon, France, called the Reformed Scottish Rite Lodge of Charity. Oh, of course, charity. This lodge was specifically orientated to destroying the idea of peace in the whole of Westphalia. So next, we're going to get on to Martinism and the French Revolution, but before that, we're going to have a very quick break. Welcome back, and we're going to get on now to Martinism and the French Revolution, lay a bit more out about that. So during the French Revolution, Martinists such as Joseph de Maistre of Savoy and Fabre d'Auvilliers of Languedoc and Castriolosto of Italy were the more notorious of the known Martinists. So if you want to look them up, you will find their connections to the French Revolution. Others, of course, stayed behind the scenes. But during the 19th century, one of the most active Martinist Cathar leaders was Charles Nodier, who became the Grand Master of the highly controversial Priory of Sion, a notorious lodge which circulated the heresy that Christ did not die on the cross but escaped with Mary Magdalene and gave birth to the dynasty of the Habsburg emperors. This is how they twist it to their own advantage. Here we see the way that these stories were used by the self-proclaimed elite bloodlines, which even used the bloodline of King David to justify their monarchy. It has been described as a Gnostic Roman Empire type of resurgence, represented by the Neo-Cathar Martinist order, in alliance with the commercial banking families such as the Barings Bank, the Commercial Bank, the Lazard Frere and the Rothschild family interests. This is the information from the French order Pierre Boudret, and we're going to be getting into some of his research in this second part of the show. Well, it is these cults, of course, which are still at the heart of world terrorism today, or the revolutionary movements which are ongoing and continuous, the continuous revolution, the permanent revolution. The setting up of multiple opposing groups is something that they've been doing for centuries. Now we see this in such ridiculously fake organisations as Antifa, Black Lives Matter, Just Stop Oil. All of these Soros-backed groups are very similar to these distraction groups of the past. The same tactics as the Mithra cult and the Venetian banking families. They used this in fueling European religious warfare during the 16th and 17th centuries. And Martinists believe that it is precisely because myths are unreasonable that they attract people. So the more outlandish the story, the more people will believe it. That's what they believe. They assume that the common people will always be attracted because they love to indulge in diversions which are unreasonable. Alexander Kojève, the close collaborator of Leo Strauss, based his argument on the underlying assumption that since the very appearance of truth is totally relative in most of the theological myths, the common people will believe in them precisely because falsity can be made attractive when it is dressed up in some kind of attractive form. Isn't that just so true today with the internet gurus? I mean, you can even see it there. This is the deception that is now acceptable. People think it's acceptable and they call it clickbait, of course. Lying, misrepresenting something is called clickbait. Most human beings, though Alexander Kojève said, should firmly believe in things that are perfectly unbelievable. And that, of course, is certainly true today. So let's go back to Martinez de Pasquale, who lived 1727 to 1774. He first created the Martinist order around 1754 in Lyon, France. Pasquale had been also the founder of the Order of the Knights of the Elected Priesthood, the Ellis-Cohens. After Pasquale's death, St. Martin tried to convert the Ellis-Cohen to his personal blend of Christian, his personal view of Christian mysticism, but he failed to convert the order, and he decided to leave. And this is their Luciferian doctrine. So we're going to now mention the author of the early Synarchy movement of empire, the French Revolution of 1789 to 1815. Pierre Baudry reveals how these so-called Gnostic lodges inspired and directed the French Revolution in his book. This part of the story is missing in such volumes as Fire in the Minds of Men, a great historical timeline, though, of the world revolutionary movement. And from the very beginning of Christianity, the Gnostics, or those who called themselves of a different opinion than the Christians, began a systematic opposition to the apostles and adopted an elitist view against the general teaching of the gospel. So hence we get Gnosis and Kabbalah. They were of the opinion that the dogmas of the gospel were good for the common people, but that the superior minds and the ruling oligarchy required a secret doctrine which was reserved for the elite only. We see this later in the Theosophy of Madame Blavatsky, and then Alice Bailey leading into the New Age, the Wilderness of the Mind, which is the product of the New Age, which is now so common. The results of this flawed thinking had resulted, of course, in the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. Humanism, communism and communitarian thinking sprang from this premise. Them becoming equal with God and then removing the power of God from the masses is the system of today. They want you to be as godless as they are. They fear those who believe in God, which is why they want to water down and destroy religions, particularly Christianity. It is the one that is, to quote the book that we covered, which was called The Dissipation of the Darkness by G.S. Lawrence. It was called the force they fear. This invisible force the early Christians had, which was invincible to these people who were opposing them. And that is the biggest secret of why they want to get rid of that religion particularly. So the proposed perpetual Labour communitarianism, which is the new future, is in reality a wholly totalitarian system. Like its founders, it is based on atheistic communism. The progress is non-democratic decision-making, since the new puppet we talked about in last week's show, Starmer, was planted in the UK. This is plainly clear within a few days. It is an elite power grab for the chosen, nothing more. There are no secrets, there are secret societies, or nowadays NGOs and favoured corporations. The magic is in the meme, the propaganda, the cover story and the lie. Devolved power which goes into local government keeps the change makers off the public radar. This is a new form of secret societies. This is why there is no real need for Freemasonry in the present time, because the new communitarian system of infiltration works much better. You merely get the public to agree to it and police themselves. It's a lot easier than being controlled by secret societies. They're public bodies. That makes it a lot easier. The pantomime villains take the stage to distract and entertain the gullible masses while the adults get on with their plans. That's what it's all about. The public are given many distractions and other places to look, so they do not focus on where the obvious power lies. And I've been trying to get this across for at least 20 years, and people are not inclined to want to believe it. Not inclined to want to believe that the system that imposed is so simple they can take it down themselves. So the idea of self-proclaimed elites were that the mysteries of Christianity be transformed back into the mysteries of Gnosis, the secret knowledge of the elite, which was in fact a compendium of cosmological and theosophical rehashing of the old pagan religions of the Orient, a so-called Neoplatonic school out of Alexandria, which it had adopted the theory of illumination, also known as emanation, and of course we get this in Kabbalah. The principal early authors were Simon Magus, Irene of Lyon, Hippolyte of Rome, Tertullian of Carthage, Clement of Alexandria, and his disciple Origen. The doctrine of emanation establishes that all things have come out and continue to come out of God without diminishing him or without weakening him, in the manner that rays emanate from the sun without reducing its power. However, as they were moving away from God and putting themselves in God's place, they were literally moving away from the true divine source of light, which they were trying to attain, and thus the more they became imperfect and corrupt over the ages. They needed then to reunite, hence we get the ramblings of the Kabbalists and their viewing of divinity through their Tree of Life and Sephiroth. This overcomplex system evolved from the overheated imaginations of such characters as Moses de Leon, resulting in the Zohar and many other books that we've talked about in our shows. Kabbalah, Conmen, have a look through that. You will be amazed at how this history has been simplified, because I had had enough of these writers who were spouting waffle upon waffle, which just merely agrees with the process that they are meant to be opposing. So in reality, the closer to matter, the more evil they were becoming. So consequently, the more they desired to become reintegrated into their original status of perfection, the more they turned away from the divine source and embraced Lucifer. Hence the overcomplex ramblings and need for ceremonial magic. The founder of Martinism, Martinez de Pasquale, spoke of reintegration of beings in their original virtues, powers and qualities. With this belief, they also obsessed that they had to combat the evil forces. This is a big part of Martinism and the Ellis Cohen. They actually get into theurgical magic. Yes, they have sacrificed animals, the head of a stag, incense going around the room, the use of amulets, mantras, and all sorts of stuff which only can bring in demons. It can never really repel them, because you're attracting them just by doing this. So this is where these people are. This search for perfection left out divine inspiration in favour of their illumined selves, which of course were not properly or fully illuminated. They chose to turn away from the real inspiration, the Holy Spirit. They indulged in ceremonial magic, more likely to attract and summon up demons than get rid of them. They had then to create defences, as in magic circles, such as the tetragrammaton and the pentagram. They were not asking the Holy Spirit for help, therefore they were hopelessly trying to defend themselves. They summoned the demons of the fallen angels. The most ancient form of such an emanation doctrine apparently comes from Zoroastrianism. The stars emanated good and evil, spirit and matter, which were incarnated by the power of light, Ormuzd, and the power of darkness, Ahriman. We cannot underestimate the influence of Zoroastrianism across the European elites. The same doctrine with the same universal characteristic of emanations are of course found in Kabbalah. Many of these things originated in the Kabbalah of the 12th century, which the writers of Kabbalah maintain goes back to about 200 AD, but it was born in the Languedoc in France. And that's according to the highest Jewish scholars. And we've covered all this in those shows, so look at Kabbalah Conmen, and you will find a huge background if you're interested. So also found in the ancient Egyptian mythology of Hermes Trismegistus and the Neo-Platonist school of Plotinus and the Gnostics. This is where it all came from through Kabbalah. The Hermetic writings of Hermes Trismegistus were given as revelations, not discoveries. And Trismegistus was absolutely influential with aristocracy. And you can see his influence way up into theosophy. They presupposed an intimate personal relationship to God, which then established the initiate into a privileged position in the world. So this, of course, is extremely Luciferian, and even if they get initiated and do not realise this, they cannot fail to realise it after they progress through these orders. Well, in fact, the term, do you have a personal relationship to God, is apparently what Gnostics say if they want to initiate you. And from the time of Emperor Julian, it was considered that Christianity was a religion created for slaves, poor people, and the ignorant masses. Therefore, we have the changing of Christianity through Constantine around 325 AD. So the original Christianity was actually feared and despised by the Roman puppet kings. We'll see our show The Force They Fear and the book Dissipation of the Darkness by G.S. Lawrence. It puts the whole thing into perspective. So the Martinists' biggest influence of their time seems to be galvanising the necessary forces in the French Revolution. But of course, they are still active today. So Pierre Boudry states, the first general aspect of this Martinist cult is quasi-Christian with Aristotelian eruptions of pseudo-knowledge. We see this also in the cover story of the Rosicrucians. Their allegory and fantasy goes through all their publications, for the Fama Fraternitatis, the Confessio to the Alchemical Wedding. From the story of Father R.C. copying the raising of Lazarus to the imitation of Christ in the initiation of Father R.C. in the Middle East. Father R.C. is a replacement for Christ and not a disciple or follower. He is the illumined master, and he is summoned at the start of every lodge meeting if the order is of the true tradition. It was another form of Gnostic, Manichaean, Cathar cultism revived in the 18th century, which had given birth to Martinism. Baudry describes this as characteristic of Satan worshipping, in that it gave birth to the beast men of the French Revolution, the first politically organised terrorists, children of Satan, known as the Terror. French Enlightenment centred essentially around the writings of Claude de Saint-Martin and Joseph de Maistre. In this well-researched and extensive work on the revolutionary Freemasonic cults behind the French Revolution, we get a huge amount of detail from Pierre Boudry, and I've been trying to just go through this and simplify it for the listener and of course for myself, because these shows are our lifelong learning project. So the main difference between a Christian and a Martinist is in that a Martinist sees distinguishing himself as an elite, distinct from the rest of humanity, and of seeing himself as a flash of illumination, a leader who is given the opportunity of taking advantage of the other. This explains the divide and rule schemes of these groups. This is key to understanding the gnosis that underlines the occult lodges of Martinism, the Ellis Cohen, and of course the Order of the Rose Cross. There is no evidence to suggest the Ellis Cohen ever ceased to exist. It was just announced publicly that it had. Their history allegedly ended in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1774, where Martinez dies. The lodge continued, I think, through his uncle in Port-au-Prince, but ironically there is still an Ellis Cohen in Haiti to this very day. Martinism was revived by Robert Amberlane in the 1940s, and we've actually quoted from his book in previous shows. The Ellis Cohen are followers of the Martinists, and they are also a ceremonial magical cult. So I hope that makes things clear. And the public statement of the Ellis Cohen from the Order of the Rose Croix website is: the Ellis Cohen is the theurgical branch of the Order of the Rose Croix, the Rose Cross, working with Martinez de Pasquale's particular form of ceremonial magic, the world's oldest system of theurgical magic. Here the initiate receives a thorough education in a form of theurgy unlike any other Western tradition, while also studying esoteric classics such as the works of Henrik Cornelius Agrippa and Peter di Albano. And actually you can buy these volumes and the green manuscript online, and when you read some of the stuff that they get up to, it really is like The Devil Rides Out. It's like the old Hammer horror movies, you know. It's quite mind-blowing. You know, it's all skulls and candles and disembodied heads of animals, and probably a lot worse. But Jacques de Livron Joachim de la Tour de la Casa Martinez de Pasquale was born around 1727, died in 1774, and he was the master theurgist and master theosopher, and they like to think he was of uncertain origin. He was founder of the L'Ordre de la Chevalier Maisons Ellis Cohen de l'Univers, commonly referred to as the Ellis Cohens, in 1761. He was the tutor, initiator and friend of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and Jean-Baptiste Villemoz. So Martinez de Pasquale appears in the history of French Masonry in 1754. He was a Spanish Sephardic Jew. Obviously, this is where the Kabbalistic influence came from. And of course, the Kabbalists were from the Languedoc, and they emigrated to Spain in the 1200s. Martinez de Pasquale and Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin were the founders of this Martinist tradition, and their web details say, "Always remember that man is the masterpiece of creation, which the Eternal emanated in his image and likeness. Let this penetrate your soul's undying nature, and separate gently your celestial and imperishable core from all foreign alloys that may have formed within you." Martinez de Pasquale and Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin were followers of the emanation doctrine. According to the research of Boudre, it is these cults which are still at the heart of world terrorism today. In the same manner that the Mithra cult and the Venetian banking families did the same thing in fueling European religious warfare during the 16th and 17th centuries. This Gnostic threat represents much more profound differences with Christianity than did the Catholic-Protestant conflicts of the so-called European religious wars. The current oligarchy consider that Christianity has been an unjust usurpation of the classical tradition of Rome, a crime and an assault on the authority of the empire. And this is the crucial difference between the Christian principle of man created in the image of God and the satanic view of man created to repair the fall of the guilty angels. It is all explained in the goal of the orders, which unite under the belief that the Lucifer spirit Samael united with Eve and begat a semi-divine son, Cain. As he left Eve before the birth of the child, Cain was the son of a widow and a serpent of wisdom. Also see our show, The Serpent Cult. The sons of fire, Cain, or as they like to call themselves, the Illumined Brotherhood, the Luciferians, work with the sons of Seth, water, their priestcraft to control the sons of Abel, also water, whom they believe through their manifesto and biblical interpretations are docile, compliant, and follow the self-appointed leadership of the brother of Cain. So the brother of the Cain are ruled by fire. And we can see this in the Rosicrucian doctrine of the blending of fire and water, so eloquently referred to by Baron de Rothschild at the 1992 Rio conference, where he said the banks were the fire of the project. And of course, the environmental side was the water. They would be the new priesthood to administer the new system of sustainable development. So the story of Lazarus, raised from the dead, holding the rose, which has to become the symbol of the RC, is important. He was also, of course, son of a widow, as allegedly was Cain. According to the RC, the rose is a symbol of the alchemical blending of the fire of Cain and the water of Abel. So let's get back to the work of the Martinist. Always remember that man is the masterpiece of creation, which the Eternal emanated in his image and likeness. Let this penetrate your soul's undying nature and separate gently your celestial and imperishable core from all foreign alloys that may have formed within you, as they have turned their backs on God. Through doing this belief in their own eternal power is all they have, and it has also killed their own divinity and isolated themselves from the Creator and indeed the creative. This is why they want to kill it in you. Such intermediaries, represented the Martinists and their men of providence, are referred to in this book, including Maximilien Robespierre of the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte. So puppets like Biden and Starmer are just that. Not even men of providence, just empty containers for the goals. We have seen this in the European Enlightenment and the hegemony of today. We have seen this in the empire builders following Cecil Rhodes into the new globalists, from nationalism, internationalism, globalism, plunder of all resources, based on the hierarchy of a few who have manipulated themselves into what they think is control of all resources. It is in effect a system of governance which enslaves the minds of the masses for the privilege of the few. The world revolutionary movement has not changed its direction. There is simply a different form of revolution. A revolution where everyone takes part. It is a global conformity to norms which are entirely based on lies. The global community, very big, very bold and very audacious lies, make up this system. A literal wilderness of the mind, created through a multitude of pointless distractions. So the idea is, of course, not to be distracted. I hope that was useful and interesting and put things into perspective. I think it's very important that we put the esoteric into perspective currently and show how it applies to what is going on at the moment. So, hope you enjoyed the show. Do support us and subscribe to us on Odyssey. You can do all this on the homepage at wondersontheworld.net. Subscribe on Spreaker and Podbean, because at the end of the year we'll be going to Podbean. And of course we do have a YouTube channel, but we prefer you to subscribe to these other channels. And do support us if you want to join the £5 a month club to support the future work of Windows on the World. And we do put out a lot of stuff, and I want to keep doing it. Then email me at info@wondersontheworld.net, and you can support us on Patreon, PayPal. So, until the next show, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting one, that's it. So, until next time, do take a look at the website and catch up on those articles that we've mentioned in the show.